Welcome to the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Kate.
My name is Jason.
And my name is Maury.
Thank you so much for being on the show, Maury. It's so great to have you here. Listeners, if you're not familiar with probably one of my new favorite people in the world, this is Maury Brown, who's joining us from Learn Larp, a wonderful company that has produced such things as New World Magischola and Imerton. And I believe you said you have a Kickstarter coming very, very soon as part of the New World Magischola brand. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me on the show. I really, really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, Monday we launch our board game for the Wizard School. It's called New World Magischola House Rivalry, and it's a game for 2 to 5 players, ages 10 and up, where you get the experience of going to Wizard School, taking classes, joining strange clubs, and throwing some charms and hexes at your opponents while you race for the House Cup. So we're in the final stages of getting ready for launch, and you can find it there on Kickstarter beginning September 18th.
Super exciting. I was very, very lucky to be one of the judges for the IGDN Awards, and New World Magischola had been one of the finalists, actually, for best, I believe it was best setting and best game of the year, actually, because it was just fantastic. And recently at Gen Con, I had the privilege of going and listening to you talk about inclusivity in design, and it made my con. It was my favorite experience of that whole con.
Oh,
so
thank you very much.
I'm so excited you're here.
Yeah. It's a topic near and dear to my heart, so I'm glad we're having a chance to talk a little bit more about it.
Excellent. So let's talk about, first of all, what does inclusivity actually look like? And why do we think it's important?
Inclusivity or inclusion means that someone can feel like they belong and are safe and are part of the universe that the world is set in, the instantiation of the game, right? There's the universe, and then there's the game that you're playing, and then sort of also around the table, because inclusion is more than representation, but it's also taking into account the person as a person. So are the components of the game such that they can distinguish the colors or read the cards? Or is the game held at a time in the evening when they're not going to be at their best? Is the game designed for the physical needs or emotional needs? So being upfront what the game is about helps you feel included. Are there politics around the table? Is one person always picking on someone else, or does this one person always get favored by the GM? Those sorts of things also have to do with inclusion. But inclusion, of course, has to do with, do I see myself? Do I see myself in this game? Do I see myself in this world? Do I see myself at this table? So that's a start.
Yeah, I agree completely. For me, I always look at everything through sort of a personal lens. It's just how I kind of interpret everything, And when I go to a table, I always want to know, in the back of my mind, I think, is it going to be okay if I make my character gay and I try to have, gay romances with NPCs or maybe other characters? Is that a thing that this table is going to accept? Is this table going to make lots of jokes about people, Mexican American people? I always think about it like that. To me, it's am I going to be able to sit down at this table and feel I guess safety is the right word, but really for me, it's more just, am I going to sit there and am I going to be able to have fun because I feel accepted, or am I going to just be alienated the whole time? Right. That's kind of where that's kind of my thinking on it.
I don't know that I have a lot to add to that, actually. Yeah, I might just nod sagely, then no one can see, and be like, yes. I think in addition to that, as a convention organizer, and you probably feel this as well, Jason, as a community organizer, especially, and probably you too with the community of New World Magischola and LARPs, Maury, it's trying to make sure the people who are present, be it your guests, your attendees, your organizers, are not they don't all look the same. Right. And they come with a variety of different abilities and disabilities and challenges and support systems, and how we can make sure that those support systems hit every level, especially at a con. Because I find sometimes you'll have one group of people who get a lot more support than others. So that's been on my mind a lot, especially having just gone through Fan Expo and Gen Con and Queen City Conquest, and Breakout is in 6 months-ish. You know, like it's on my mind all the time, it turns out.
Yeah. No, it's very true because it's not just who's around, but it's who's in charge too.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not only do I see myself, but do I see myself also in powerful positions or in different ways. So it's a little bit kind of what Jason was saying too. It's like, is it safe for me to be powerful, to be in charge? Or is this a place where I'm allowed to be, but I'm only allowed to be at a certain level? And then you start checking yourself, right? Is this something I can play? Is this something I should introduce? Is this a battle I want to to go up against? So it goes with, I call it alignment, because it goes with, does what you say equal what you do, equal what you see, equal what you enforce, equal what you promote, right? Are all those things there, or do they work at cross purposes? Do you say, sure, we're open to everybody? And then if you're someone who doesn't openly see themselves there, says, yeah, they say that, but then how come nobody like me is actually going? Or how come nobody like me is on the leadership? And so giving someone permission isn't the same thing as being included.
Absolutely.
It sounds like we're kind of talking about at like two different levels almost. Like we're talking about like inclusivity at the table, right? Like in the actual game we're playing. And then this sort of like bigger level, or this other level of like, you know, being a community organizer, or like public spaces that you're responsible for, and like what inclusivity looks like there. And the thing that to me, the really interesting question here, as far as inclusivity goes, is if you're a private group of players, right? My home game, right? If it's our home game, why might you want to focus on, you know, ideas that are in inclusivity, like representation and things like that? Like, I think that's an interesting question. Like, why is it important, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. That sometimes we have a core group of players that we play with, and it can become an issue of who's at the table when you have people coming in and coming out, or if somebody moves away and now you want to bring somebody new into that group. But if you're talking about, sometimes the people that we play with a lot can be a fairly homogenous group, not because we intended it for that way, but it just happens to maybe be how it happened, right? And now we've been playing together for a while. And one of the things that can happen when you have a fairly homogenous group, or a group that has just sort of gotten really, really comfortable with each other, is that you can play over the same things over and over again.
Yeah.
And so just from a gameplay perspective, introducing some of those different things to cause people to think and to think of new scenarios is good, but it also can be from a normative perspective, where you just keep reinforcing some of the same ways of thinking. And so you can tell different stories by introducing those things, which is good on a gameplay level, but you can help each other grow as people and think about different things as a group of players by introducing those as well.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you know, going back, I'm thinking back now to like the beginning of the Gauntlet, which was like in 2013 or something. And this is before we were an online group, but we were nevertheless a public open group in Houston. And one of the things we've done since the very beginning is we don't allow closed groups on our calendar. Like it's not allowed. Like your games must be open table. Like it's a requirement. And the reason why is because it's kind of a personal thing. I was like, this is what I think. And so this is how I'm affected. So I'm going to make it the rule for the group. Right. But like for me, when I first got to Houston, I was looking for a game group, and I'll tell you, as whether these feelings were justified or not, as a gay man, as a person of color, there were all these groups who had been playing together for 20 or 30 years, right? They all kind of looked the same. And sometimes they were taking new players and sometimes they weren't. But I always remember thinking, I don't know if I feel comfortable, you know? Like I don't feel like I can really introduce myself to that group, because I would be stepping into a situation where they have their way of doing things and they may not want, you know, what I'm offering. And so we've always had like an open table policy for that reason. I think, that was the genesis of it. But as I kind of think back on it, I like that we have that we don't like crystallize, you know?
Yeah. I think the reason I always try to introduce, even if I'm playing with all my white friends, because I have a fair number of white friends, if it's all of us just sitting down at a table playing, I really want to try to introduce, if they're not going to play diverse characters, then every goddamn NPC is going to be not them, because gaming has the extraordinary power to show us empathy. and to teach us life lessons that we may not experience, but we can definitely perceive and notice in a role-playing game. And when you, as the GM at least, or even as a player, bring that to the table, you're inviting conversation and you're inviting a moment of learning, and everything stops just being the normalized, oh, it's a bunch of white people playing a white people game who are playing white characters, doing straight white things, right? And
solving everything with violence. Sorry.
Yeah, let's finish it off. And they're playing fantasy and it's violent.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, that's my favorite part. Nope. I like that you filled in the blanks for me.
And we do.
Yeah, so I think that's, yeah.
I was going to say, now that you brought that up, it's, I agree, it's important, but then we also have to be really careful, right? Because if you have a group of white people around the table and we say we're going to play non-white characters, are we doing that respectfully, and we doing that with research and not doing it and with complexity? That's, I think, one of the biggest things, is that we have a tendency to start reducing people to certain aspects of themselves, whether it's their ability or their ethnicity or their gender or their sexuality. It's often one of those things. And there are stereotypes about those varieties of people that we can internalize, again, not necessarily maliciously, but we start just reinforcing them. And so, for example, one of the things we did with House Rivalry, the board game that's coming out next week, is we have the variety of character names. So we have Soledad Reyes, right? And we have Martín Spinoza, right? And Martín is definitely Hispanic, and he's wearing a suit, right? And he's a smart and charismatic Hispanic character, right? We have another character in the world who's a farmer or a rancher, right? But we weren't going to put Martín Spinoza as a farmer or a rancher, and we weren't going to put Martín Spinoza as some sort of potion dealing bad guy, right? Because all of these things would fill into some terrible Hollywood stereotypes, or stereotypes about someone with a Central American name, right, with a Spanish name and with a Hispanic look. And so you have to think about those things. Like, just changing the name is not enough. But the name is also, I've been told by some people, like, just seeing, like, whether there's a Professor Valdez, right? To see that is beginning to say, I see myself in that game. But you want to then be careful about, what do you have Professor Valdez say and do? Because you're then reinforcing tropes.
Well, so that sounds like a pretty good, well, I was about to say that was a good segue, but that's your job, Kate, to do segues and questions.
Thanks, Jason. That's what I was going to say. I was like, let's move on to, how do we do that? How do we handle that? How do we play with inclusivity as a goal, but not jump into stereotypes and not do the things that are only reinforcing the sometimes problematic views of culture?
Well, I don't think it's hard. I mean, I think there are some things you can do at, where if we're talking like at the sort of like at the table level, there are a few things that I would just say that kind of bug me a lot when I'm at a table. Like, I don't like it when people I'm not fond of accents. They can be a real landmine. I mean, they can be a real trouble spot for me personally at the table. People will disagree with that because people love to do voices. I get it, but
we tell people to be very, very careful with accents also for that reason, because, well, and for another reason, most people don't do them well. And,
there's that too, right? Yeah.
And they can't keep them. Like, they'll start with it, and then they lose it. And that's not just to say that they're bad. It's just this cognitive load, right? Like you're role playing and you're doing these other things. So unless you're very, very good at them and have practiced them and can do it respectfully, we're kind of like, you don't have to use an accent to show your character. You can show your character through other ways, because they have been used historically by comedians and in other ways to make fun and oppress in a way that's not so far off from blackface, yellowface, redface. And so I agree with you that being very cautious about accents is important. For me, I think there's two things we can do. From one is from the game design level, we are always putting in, we're working on 2 RPGs that'll be out in January, and we're putting in entire sections for, hey, Facilitator, notes. Like, we're dealing with this topic and you're playing these characters and, let's talk about this at the table and here's some ways to be respectful and here's some stuff. So it's in the book so that people can do. But even if it's not in the book, I think it's the responsibility of the GM to broach the topic. How are we going to play this? And what does it mean to be respectful? And what does it mean to be stereotypical? And what does it mean to be appropriative? And what sorts of, where are the boundaries that we have here? And to be then you have a transparency and you have people looking at each other too, going, yeah. And then just to say, we might screw this up.
Right.
We're recognizing that this is a value that we have and that this is something that we're trying. And we know it's not easy because we have a lot of stuff in our heads from the media, right? From other people that we've been around. And sometimes it just comes out because we're in the middle of role playing and we're keeping track of math and we're keeping track of a social situation and we're doing these things. And so acknowledge that it's very likely that you're going to screw this up at some point. And so just hold each other accountable and also let each other make mistakes, knowing that we're giving each other the benefit of the doubt of trying not to if we've had this discussion.
I think when people are doing it wrong for the wrong reasons, right? And we possess the capacity to to decipher such things at the table, right? But no, you're right. Like, I think creating space to make mistakes is like super important, right? Not only because like it's just going to happen. I think it would be unworkable not to, but also I think when you create that space, it kind of gives people permission to try, at least to try with play, to play diversity, to try to do, these like tougher topics. So.
Yeah, that's a subject that's come up recently in a few places for me where, people who are part of minority groups are really tired of seeing people in power raising their hands about it and being like, oh, can you give me permission to play these people who look like you? Yeah, yeah. Can you do this emotional labor for me? Because you're not doing enough already. Right? Like,
yeah.
And we need to be cognizant of that and I think, for me, it's taking ownership that you want to try to be inclusive. And that means maybe go read some blogs by people who you're trying to include in your game so that you're not asking them to do the labor, but you are still engaging in the topic and researching and beginning to understand what that means. Because going in completely blind, just being like, oh, I want to play a black character because I want to play a black character. And that's it. That's all I'm going to go in with is my white knowledge about being a black character might not be perceived so great. It might come out poorly.
Or I'm just not going to try to play a black character because because it's too much work or I don't want to offend someone, right? I mean, to me, that's almost the more insidious thing, right? Like, I know when someone's being a dope with their characterization, right? And I can call them on that or at least like have a conversation about it later. It's the other thing that creates like a sort of inertia, right? Like on some of this stuff. But blogs are good though. I agree 100%. I don't game at conventions much. I don't go to them very often. I'm starting to, but I generally don't. And all of my gaming experiences are mostly confined to this really, really highly curated space that I'm in called the Gauntlet, right? And so I don't actually get to like be exposed to a lot of the issues out there, but I know enough to read the people like Kate, for example, who do go and who are there on the front lines. And so it's helpful. Like, it's super helpful. Like, there's no reason not to stay abreast of those things.
I like what you guys are saying about we all have a responsibility. I mean, I talked a little bit about the GM sort of setting the tone and broaching the topics, but it is very true that each person has a responsibility for keeping abreast of the topics and of doing it because you're telling a story together when you're at the table. And so you can't just say there's one person who's the arbitrator for whether or not this is okay or not okay, because you're setting a culture of how we're going to play this game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitely on every level you need to bring it as a player, as an organizer, as a facilitator, as a GM. It's not just the GM's responsibility to be like, okay, we're going to play an inclusive game today, right? Like, it's got to be everyone at the table being like, yeah, we're going to buy in. Or if I am playing with a bunch of people who are going to do that and I'm a player, I'm going to do my best to make my own NPCs and include them as a diverse population and not let everyone just be like, okay, we're doing this and we're just going to play in this small midtown American town where it's just a bunch of people we all understand. And I find as a player, what I try to do in those situations is try to play a character who's not like everybody else, and do so with thought and carefulness and really watching how I'm doing it and making sure I'm not just being like, okay, well, I'm going to play a gay character today, so he's going to have a ridiculous voice and, you know, hit on everyone inappropriately.
Right? Yeah. Right,
yeah. Well, I was given a lesbian character one time as a pre-gen, and that was her complication.
Yeah.
That she was a lesbian. And I was like, can you clarify this for me for a second? As a person who's, you know, pansexual, can you clarify why my attraction to women would be a problem? And his response was like, oh, you just hit on women at the wrong moment.
That's like the old Ninja Turtle game. Do you guys remember this? The old Palladium Ninja Turtles game that listed homosexuality in the list of insanities.
Why is there a list of insanities?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is like it's the 90s, right? But like I had that book and what they did because even back then there was something of an outcry about it. And what they did was they used whiteout. They used whiteout. They just had all the store owners take whiteout and just white out that part of the list. And so when I bought it, I had the whited out version, and I didn't, this is pre-internet, so I didn't know like what the deal was. And I scratched it off, and there it was, and I was like, "Fuck."
Oh, that's incredible.
I'm sorry, someone designed a game that made you feel that way.
I mean, this is a long time ago, and I look back on it, it's just kind of funny, but it's just your little story reminded me of that, like this idea of like. That's her complication.
But right, this is rampant. I was given a pre-gen character who was a bisexual woman, and she had two things. One was that she was supposed to want to sleep with anybody and everybody, of course, right? And then second, because of course, bi, right? Bi woman in particular. And then here was the kicker: she couldn't get information from anybody unless she slept with him.
Oh my God.
Which was
wow.
So it was
Jesus Christ.
like you have to do that
That's
first.
my life. Why are you making fun of that?
This is my like this
That's
is
how it was when I was bisexual.
Yeah, of course. This is how you get information from anybody. Hey.
Well, so like, I mean, I'm curious about it. You kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, Kate, like, GMs and facilitators, like if there are things that we want to do, like, let's say we do want to explore topics associated with, with race or topics associated with, being disabled or whatever, right? Like, what do we think are some of the best practices there as a GM? I think that would be super helpful for people to hear.
Well, I recently ran, my game that deals with everything because it's 1930s Dust Bowl America and a carnival. And I learned this trick from Jason Pitt, who wrote SIG. Mm-hmm. He's fabulous. You should go check him out. When he runs games that have problematic content, what he ends up doing is creating a safe space to use problematic words without using problematic words. Because I really want to explain that you don't use the word. You would say like, God damn you, you sexist slur. Like you would literally say sexist slur or racial slur in those spaces. Like if you are playing with this hard content, that's a big asterisk, but it lets you go to that space, but not be problematic openly.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that, and I think it's super interesting. I don't know. I think like me, I think I would be inclined to just like maybe just not allow that kind of stuff, period, rather than have that sentence structure or that structure of doing it. But I'd be curious to see what people's experiences with it were, Yeah,
I'd like to hear from people who aren't a bunch of white people about that one.
Yeah. I think that'd be
not gonna
cool.
Lie.
Yeah.
Because that's all I've heard it from. Yeah. But that was one thing I've heard of, like when you're going to play with that content, if you're bringing that content to the table as a way of making sure you're laying out straight out, no one's going to use actual words. Because sometimes when you bring that content to the table, people use it as an excuse to be bad.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not going to set out ground rules around it, sometimes that can get pretty squicky.
Yeah, I think expectations setting is really important, right? I mean, I preach that.
Tone conversation.
I preach it constantly, right? Like I set expectations. And part of setting expectations, I think, is if you want to deal with like themes like that, if you want to include that kind of content in your game, I think at the very least you need to make sure everybody's on board with it in the beginning, and that means having a conversation about it, right? About a year ago, I ran an Urban Shadows thing set in Austin, Texas, and I lived in Austin for many years. And one of the themes I was interested in exploring was gentrification, right, which is a big deal in Austin, and in particular, like gentrification of East Austin, right, which is typically where more Black residents live, is East Austin. And so I just kind of had that conversation with them. I said, hey, look, I'm really interested in exploring this idea of the metaphor of like these sort of like supernatural beings moving into this space, having be kind of a metaphor for like gentrification, right? And we talked about it. I did my research. We had a conversation about like, the various historical implications of it and what sorts of things to be on the lookout for, what sorts of playbooks and moves would be particularly interesting for exploring that content, right? And it was about 20 minutes, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. It wasn't super long, but I found that it at least created a space for everyone to try, right? And that was really important to me. And I can't say that there were any moments where I felt like it went poorly, like I think overall I was pretty happy with it. And I think setting expectations is a big part of that.
I think you and I preach the same thing. Transparency of expectations, setting expectations, making sure people know, transparency of content, and also have a way since it's emergent content, that can happen a way of changing it or opting out of it.
Yeah.
If it starts to come up. I think one thing you can do too is to have the bad people that you want to explore, would that be played by the GMs, such that your players aren't being bad to each other in a way that they're being bad against a system. You're sort of changing it a little bit from PvP to PvE in a way there. But because one of the dangers that you can have is essentializing down to only the experience is only being oppressed. Like you don't have solidarity, right? So whether you're doing an ethnicity or a racial oppression or a gender oppression or a sexuality oppression, right? A lot of times these games can try to say that that's their central challenge, right? And that certainly isn't part of their life, but that isn't always the only thing that they want to play on, right? Or the only thing that would be an important thing for them to play on, right? They also would have community solidarity, and they would also have, and so that's one of the things is where sometimes where we can find it interesting to play on and to get people to think about, for people who are marginalized groups, they play on it, quote unquote, play on it all the time, and B, that can really make the game become only about that when that isn't true of what a full experience is. I really have been thinking a lot lately about what kinds of behaviors we want to encourage at the table. And if I encourage people to play horrible people, I don't know that that's even for this experience of trying to understand it. I haven't decided yet whether I think that's a good idea or not. I used to think that was a really good idea so that they could understand what it was like. And now I'm worried that it's reinforcing and
that's
desensitizing.
Super interesting. It's really interesting, this idea of like, as the GM, like assume that responsibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that's what you want to do, like,
mm-hmm.
You be the one and let the players have that solidarity. Super, super fascinating. I've never really thought about it in those terms. Something worth thinking about though, right?
Yeah, I'm working on a Moscow Urban Shadows campaign. In modern Russia and historical Russia, all of Russia has problems. It's a very toxic culture in some areas, as we all know. And initially I was going to be like, my players are going to be Russians and da-da-da-da. And my players were like, no, we're going to play the people. This world is horrible too. And it took the onus off of them to be hard on each other. And it's all on me now. And I found that space much easier to navigate when they've had outlets with each other versus having to like not have those moments with each other. And it's grew into like how you build community and how you help each other and support each other. And there are beautiful moments in that oppression that is Russia in a way I wasn't expecting. And I think you bringing that up, Maury, it kind of makes me go, oh yeah, now it is on me, and I can
makes sense,
release
right?
the pressure valve, right? Yeah. Thanks, Maury.
Oh, we have to have a part 2 discussion. We'll try. Let's try it more. See how it goes. I was going to bring up bringing disability into the game. And a lot of times a lot of RPGs, particularly in the fantasy genre, but not only, sci-fi too, and others, healing is very trivial. And, you take your lumps and you just wait your time, or you use your points and then you're healed. And there's there's the assumption that things can be healed. And that leads to this assumption that any sort of disability should be fixed rather than just accepted. And it also doesn't take into account things like cumulative trauma or how you've been healed, but there's a lasting effects from it. And that makes for this very interesting problem with ableism, I think, a lot of times at the table, where it's like, oh, it's okay. Just, it'll just get fixed. Somebody have any healing points? And particularly, we know Dungeons and Dragons had this, where it was like disability meant you got extra points on the other side because you took this, problem on the one side. And so gamifying it in that way, I think, is particularly insidious. And so one of the things we had to do with New World Magischola was to say, some things can't be magicked away, right? And in fact, some things we don't want to magic away because they are just who we are and are not considered a detriment. And so it's something really interesting to think about at the table too.
Yeah, that's great. I ran a Dungeon World game fairly recently, I guess. Well, it happens pretty frequently. A couple of the monsters in Dungeon World have a move that's like they get to, gnaw off a limb or whatever, right? Like that's a thing they get to do, and it's kind of automatic and it just happens. And I face that sometimes. Like I face the situation where the players are like, well, can't I just take it to the cleric or take it to the temple and get it put back on? Like they can't even, it takes them a minute to get over this little hill of like, oh yeah, my character just has to live without a hand now, right? Like, let's see what that's like, Mm-hmm. So yeah, I never thought about it in terms of like that sort of reflexivity based off the sort of origin of the hobby or whatever, but that makes a lot of sense.
With Crossroads, I have one of the playbooks that's the mermaid, and I removed the option for her to have legs. So, and it's not something where she wants to have legs. She doesn't want to be on the land. She's not the Little Mermaid. It's just this character who has a different level of disability than some of the other characters, and how she navigates the world around her without it being like, we need to fix the mermaid. It's no, the mermaid is what she's meant to be and is living in this world differently than how you experience it. Because I don't know, I just wanted the mermaid to not be able to be like, I just grow legs.
Right, yeah.
It's like, no, that's not how that goes. How do you get around? Do you have a wheelchair? That's great. So I think that's a really hard one because it is very inobvious to people who are able-bodied.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, huge blind spot, right? I mean, yeah, massive.
Yeah. So we've talked about players and GMs. We've touched briefly on how your community needs to reflect everybody, and including people in power. Now, when it comes to layering stuff in metaphor, which is probably how most people try to include that content, right? Where we're not dealing specifically with us playing protesters at a Black Lives Matters protest. That's not usually how we go about that game, but we're gonna, I don't know, maybe set it around a monument in space and see what happens. How do we layer that metaphor in a way that's not appropriative, but is still accessible and is talking about what we want to talk about?
I think this one's all you, Maury.
Oh.
This is why we had you. I think this is why we're having you on.
And go.
And go.
This sounds way out of my pay grade, so great question.
You can do it, Jason. You're going to answer it too, man.
Yes. Well, first off, we should say that's very difficult. So is telling a good story, right? Players can see through, just like students can see through when you're trying to be didactic, right? And you're like, here it is. I'm going to beat you over the head with this hammer and understand this, and you'll do it this way. And so being too face forward with it, too on the nose with it, is likely to backfire and also cause all those bleed feelings, right? That in a very negative way, so that you're actually, in attempting to be inclusive, being the opposite of inclusive, because you're then reducing the play to that issue. And so metaphors need to be subtle, and they need to be broad, I guess would be the right way to put it, so that it isn't such that people who come to the games bring their own selves, their own experience, their own marginalization, their own privilege, their own social capital, their own all of these things. And what they see in a game, similar to what you see in a movie or in a fiction, people get different things out of it, right? And so when you're writing because you have a goal, a theme that you hope they're going to engage with, but people are going to engage with it differently. And so if you're too on the nose with it, then people are like, that's still not me, right? Whereas if it's broader and more open, then people can say, this oppression that I'm playing out among these two space planets feels like the sort of religious marginalization that I have felt, or this gender marginalization that I have felt, or this ethnic marginalization that I have felt, or the sexuality marginalization that I have felt, because what you're playing out is the power differentials and the way that people can behave, and not necessarily playing out X equals Y. And you have to be really, really careful with X equals Y things, because those essentialize and those can become very didactic. And you also will get this resistance. I am X, but I am not Y. Right? And so...
Right, yeah.
So what you want is you want people to...
We've never heard that argument before.
What? Not all men? What?
Ever on the internet, yeah.
Never, right? And the resistance actually then makes it so that they can't see or feel what it is you're hoping that they will. And so I would argue that some of the best ways is that the people don't understand that they're doing anything other than playing the superficial thing until later. And later they go, I was being a wizard, and we were talking about chupacabras, and I was all in that. And then later on, you were like, chupacabras were potentially sentient creatures who don't use language the same way we do. Well, that might be like something from my life. And so the best metaphors are subtle. And so that's one of the things I'm struggling with this game that I told you I was writing about statues. I think right now it's too didactic, because it's too raw. It's really raw for me. And even though I've said it in space, then it's like, you're in space, but okay, this is, I haven't removed myself from it enough to get those good metaphors. But it's also, you're going to turn some of your audience off, I think, because if they can see through it, then that's like, I don't want to play this learning game. Don't make me, engage with your theme. I want to play, because a lot of times people go to games to escape. And so it is possible to go to a game to escape and have it reflect back. Good, especially good science fiction and fantasy can really do that.
Yeah, when you're running games, Jason, how do you layer in that stuff? I know you do. So
I do, yeah. I mean, well, okay. So and I promise this is not a cop-out answer. It's really what I think. I play a pretty big variety of games, right? And I like to find the games that have it built in, right? Like, there are games out there that have mechanical and textual support for exploring like various topics. Like, you look at like Dog Eat Dog. Wow, what a great game for exploring the horrors of colonialism and all the sort of like after effects of it, right? You look at, this is probably not a metaphor, but Steal Away Jordan, right? Like, there's a game that is, you play a slave and all the stuff that, in the Antebellum South and all the stuff that comes with that. Monster Hearts, right? Like, I Monster Hearts is, to a great degree, it's about exploring like queer identity. And so I actually always start with, well, is there a game that's doing it? Like, if I've really got this like stuck in my craw, like I want to explore this topic, is there a game that's doing this topic? And can I bring that to the table? This other question, which I think is what you're getting at, Kate, of like layering it into a game that is not necessarily about that. Like I kind of mentioned with Urban Shadows just a little bit ago, although you can kind of make the case that Urban Shadows does in a way. It's an edge case, I think. It's tricky. It's really tricky. I guess I definitely don't go with this sort of like, like Maury just described of like, oh, hey guys, did you see what we just did? I do try to talk about it up front, and I'm pretty open about like what I want to try to get done in the game. And I elicit player feedback on that. But I guess, I probably don't do it much. Like in, the games where I prepare a scenario is going to be stuff like Dungeon World. And I just don't I don't really explore super deep topics in Dungeon World, right? I just go for the killing and the horror and the mystery, right? So yeah, for me, it's more about like finding the right game, I think. And I think that's, and there are games out there. Like, if you don't think there are games out there, you're not looking hard enough,
No, that's totally true. I get player buy-in. Yeah, I don't tend to try to win over people. I'm not going to lie. I tend to be like, all right, I want to play this game and I want it to be about X, Y, Z. Who's in it? Which one of you suckers is going to do this with me?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't try to be like, oh, it's going to be super metaphorical. It's going to be metaphorical enough. And I think, I'll layer things a little bit more into Monster Hearts. Like, I won't let it go to gonzo places. I'll be like, no, we're going to stay present with this game. or Dream Askew. I think Dream Askew is a really great way of looking at queer communities and being like, we're gonna stay with this. You don't get to go over there and kick ass. We're gonna stay over here. So I think part of it is reading the book and knowing what the book or the game is about, and staying present with the game, not letting your players necessarily leave the space because they're finding it too uncomfortable sometimes, and holding that space. When we did Fall of Magic, we had a lot of interesting metaphors happening in Fall of Magic about identity and queer identity and homoeroticism and the erasure of homoeroticism. Without player buy-in and without a conversation about it. It was just, you just put it out there. So I know you do these things. I
do. Yeah. Well, I guess, I'm going to be honest though, like it's probably not a conscious thing, right? I think it's probably just, it comes from a place of like having lived certain experiences, and I work it into my play, and it's just a thing that happens. Like I know what you're referring to. And that was something that was this idea of like intensely toxic masculinity and sort of like the connection between that and homoeroticism. That is something that came from like a personal place of like my life experiences. So it definitely wasn't like a conscious thing. And I think that's okay, right? Like, I mean, you just can't plan for everything. I do think that there's like two different conversations here though, right? And just to kind of ping pong back and forth between like what we're saying and what Maury is saying, which is, I think it's different from the game design perspective, right?
Absolutely.
Like the game designer's like approach to this is really different from in my opinion, than the game facilitator's approach. So.
That makes sense.
That's why we play the games that the designers make.
Yeah, exactly.
That totally makes sense. But I really like your point about holding space and not letting them leave. And conversely, obviously the GM can move away from something that is suddenly become problematic, but letting them have the time to wrestle with some of the content is important. A lot of time, GMs can sometimes feel that these quieter scenes are something you have to move more quickly through to get to the battle, or to what's seen as the more epic or climactic scene. And a lot of times the quieter scenes can be the most meaningful. I will also say that one of the things that GMs can do is provide synthesis. And so you have player one at your table that's exploring this specific thing that's related to their character. Player two that's doing the same sort of thing. Player three, they're all in the party. You as the GM, knowing themes and things that you're working on that may have already happened or are upcoming, can start to weave those stories together, which you already do, right? But you can weave them together on a bit more of a metaphorical level as you start to look at the conflicts that the individual characters are dealing with. A lot of times individual characters are dealing with not only internal conflicts that have some similarity, but they're doing different approaches to a centralized conflict that you've introduced. And that can be an interesting way to look at things like, oh, well, this person has completely different resources than you do and a completely different background and backstory than you do. And look how they're handling this problem differently.
This has been some amazing advice. I mean, I've learned so much from both of you.
I've learned tons. Yeah,
I've learned tons too.
I wish the listeners could see me, because I'm just like nodding my head, like yeah. Like,
yeah. What games? We've mentioned a few already, but are there other games people are like, this is something you should go play to experience what I want to see in the world of design or in the world of inclusive games? Maury, you want to hit us off with that?
It's this time where I say, hey, we have a board game now. It's not
go for it, pitch away.
This is not an RPG. We do have an RPG coming, but we do have the board game coming that is worked on having inclusivity at the art level, and at the power level structure that's in the game, so that you see people of different ethnicities, people of different body sizes and types, people of different abilities, people who are of different genders. But as far as a role-playing game goes, I have an obscure Finnish role-playing game that's now available in the United States called Age of the Tempest. And it is designed as a family role-playing game. And it's pretty accessible for parents and kids to play together. It's also fun to play without kids because it upends certain tropes. Like there's a swineherd in this game. And so you can play, like me as the parent can play the swineherd, and therefore let the kids, because dynamics like parent to child or older kid to younger kid, when you're at the table, can continue even if you're both playing powerful characters. So I can intentionally play like the swineherd and be like, oh, you're gonna have to you're gonna have to decide. And it does a really good job. Age of the Tempest does a really good job with character art that is gender neutral, with different categories of characters and ways of solving things that aren't always with violence. And it's got some funny bits in it. So I would highly recommend Age of the Tempest.
Cool. How about you, Jason?
I would say Urban Shadows. The Urban Shadows character sheet is terrific because it lets you just circle like your option for your race or ethnicity, and it has a nice comprehensive like list of options, and it's presented with no comment. And I love that because it allows you to you have to reckon with it, for one thing. Like you don't get to just default to being a white guy or whatever, right? So I love that, and in fact the whole text is really conscious of stuff like that, and so it's great. I think from an art standpoint, I think 7th Sea is terrific in terms of representation. Go check that out. I actually haven't played 7th Sea, but the books are beautiful and the art is really, really high watermark for representation, in my opinion. And then another thing I'm going to point out, which is probably a little unusual for our listenership, but I want to point them to it anyway, an OSR product called Yunsuin. And I've covered it on my other podcast, Fear of a Black Dragon, which is out by the time this comes out. So go listen to it. But basically, it is an approach to an Asian-inspired setting that is not just Orientalism. And it's done really in a really great way. And for more information, please go listen to that episode of Fear of a Black Dragon. So, awesome. As an example of like how you can do other cultures, but in a way that, for example, in this case, is not Orientalism.
Cool. I think we've talked about all the ones that I had written down. I'm also going to mention Kikanga, because that's a really awesome game by Black designers about African myth. And because you haven't said it, Maury, I'm going to point out New World Magischola as a LARP that everyone should try and engage with.
Jason Morningstar keeps telling me, right? Like,
right?
It's different than some other LARPs you might have played. We would love to have you. There's a LARP in a box version called A Wolf by Any Other Name that you can play at home with anywhere from 6 to 25 people, and it gives you a little bit of a chance to play with gender neutral characters, consent-based magic system, that sort of stuff. So that's a little bit more accessible because we won't have an event until next summer for a LARP event for next summer. We have Yule coming up in December, but it's sold out. So
fair enough. All right, so why don't we go to Giving Me Life?
Hi, listeners. I want to interject real quickly to remind you that Gauntlet Con is taking place October 20th through the 22nd. Gauntlet Con is an online gaming convention. We have over 100 gaming events for you to join. Early registration for Gauntlet Patreon supporters is taking place right now. Leading up to Gauntlet Con, our zine, Codex, will be holding a writing contest called Keepers of the Gauntlet. For this contest, we're asking you to write a Dungeon World starter or OSR scenario. There is a $100 cash prize for the winner, and the winning scenario will be published in Codex and be featured on one of our podcasts. Up to 2 runners-up will receive a $50 cash prize. Anyone can participate. The deadline for submissions is October 16th. For more details, find the link in our show notes or go to gauntlet-rpg.com. Thanks.
Giving Me Life. It's that time.
I like the way you said it. Giving me life. So about that.
It's been intense lately. Jason, what's giving you life?
Mine's real easy. I've been playing this game on my Switch called Sonic Mania. It is basically a sort of, it's like Sonic the Hedgehog, but like kind of redone, for the modern era. But it's basically just Sonic the Hedgehog, and I grew up with Sonic the Hedgehog. This game feels really great. Every time I turn it on, I feel like I'm 13 again or something. I don't know. It's big nostalgia hits, and I quite like it.
What about you, Maury? What's giving you life?
I found a new microbrewery here in Charlottesville that has a hibiscus saison that has changed my life, and I'm discovering that we're getting more and more little microbreweries around here, and I'm turning into a beer head as I try them. I know. But this hibiscus saison, it's pink. It looks like a Jolly Rancher, but it doesn't taste like one. It tastes just awesome.
I would buy that beer. Like,
see?
That's the beer I would
I know.
Yes.
You would not. I was afraid.
I don't like hibiscus at all.
See, it's really,
I just don't like hibiscus as a flavor.
Yeah. Now this is this may be not your cup of tea, but The other thing is
Or beer.
I'm just really basking in my daughter. My daughter Maria is 11, and by the hour, it seems, turning into this true preteen teen. And watching her, we had our first curling iron burn, and we had our first. I know we had our first pimple, and we had to learn about concealer. And there's just like every day she's different, and like it's a really it's really fun and neat to look at. And she's my third child, and I'm much more humorous about it now. Right? So I'm sort of like, oh, she ran through the house and slammed the door. That's the first. Cool. You know? So that's definitely giving me life.
Fabulous. So mine is kind of gaming based because I've done 3 conventions in 4 weeks, so I'm a little gamified. Yeah. I know, right? And recently I was a guest at Queen City Conquest in Buffalo, which was amazing. I got to sit on a panel with Angela Maury and Senda Linau and Jen Adcock and talk about diversity in gaming, which turned out to talk about like women in gaming because none of us could really talk to any other subject, and it felt gross to be like, hey, here's our advice as white people to deal with that. But after the panel, one of the people who had asked a question was Effie Madison, and she's actually one of the organizers of Queen City Conquest, and asked a question about how we make cons more inclusive and whatnot. And we had this conversation that I ended up answering most of because I was the only con organizer on the panel. And afterwards, when I was saying goodbye to her, I was like, Effie, why weren't you on that panel with us? Right? Like, why weren't you up there? And she paused before she was going to answer me, and then just kind of like stood stunned for a second and finally went, I was about to answer because I'm no one.
Yeah.
But after talking to you, I would never answer that again. And I was like, yes. So that was my like giving me life. It's like, oh yeah, this is why I put up with all the crappy like sexist bullshit at all these other cons, is because this moment I made someone feel important.
Yay.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so that gave me life. Well, Maury, I really want to thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about this topic.
I had so much fun.
I learned so much.
We can do it again over a hibiscus saison or another beer that you like.
Oh, I don't know.
I'll totally drink pink beer with you at Metatopia, Maury. Like,
are you coming to Metatopia?
I will be at Metatopia. Yes.
Yes, pink beer at Metatopia. I'll choke it down. All right.
No one's going to force you to drink pink beer. You get beer of choice.
Consent in my beer. I'm so excited.
Consent-based beer. That's it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll see you in a couple months, and have a wonderful evening.
You too, guys.
Thank you, everybody, and I hope you also have a fabulous evening.